When looking over the history of WWF and having big matches such as WrestleMania matches that are sort of WrestleMania moments that live on for history, in WWF, we always look at matches that never had a chance to take place, such as like Ric Flair against Hulk Hogan, which was supposedly supposed to be the big main event of, I guess that would be WrestleMania 8, which was held in Indianapolis. At that time, it sort of looked like, if you were watching the show, that they were building up to Hogan versus Flair. They even had a press conference announcement that announced it was going to be Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair, where it was really, really fun on Superstars. They had a whole bunch of guys lined up on a panel, and then Jack Tunney came out and made his pick, and it was going to be Hogan. And from that point, because of what happened at the Royal Rumble and what happened, at Saturday night's main event, with Sid walking out on Hulk Hogan. They ended up changing the card, which ended up being Macho Man versus Ric Flair, and ended up being Sid versus Hogan. Macho Man versus Ric Flair is debatably, in my mind, at least in the top 10 WrestleMania matches of all time. Sid versus Hogan was sort of billed as Hulk Hogan's retirement from wrestling. At that point, I really think that they believed that Hulk Hogan was going to be a guy that was going off to make movies and, wasn't really going to be a part of the plan. WrestleMania 9, we ended up getting Hogan coming back to wrestle a tag team match with Brutus the Barber Beefcake against Money Inc. He really wasn't in that main event spot anymore, and I remember reading in a book that's about WrestleMania. It came out around WrestleMania 2000. The guy that was putting together WrestleMania from Las Vegas was like, Hulk Hogan's going to be there, and WWF was assuring him, he's not a part of the plan. He might not be there. And then when it came down to it, and Hogan was there, and he ended up being in the main event, they were like, "Oh, this was the plan all along," and they were like, "No, this wasn't the plan at all." But Hogan versus Flair definitely was one of those dream matches from the 80s and 90s. We know Hogan was kicking ass, drawing big numbers for WWF, while, NWA and WCW at the time, as a lot of people still like to call it, really wasn't drawing huge numbers, but really did have a fan base behind it. And people, really thought, what would happen if, the NWA and Vince McMahon came together and they had a super card, and, we would get to see these dream matches that, what would happen if it was Hogan versus Flair. And people really thought that Vince was going to capitalize on that, and we ended up not getting it. And probably when you look at WrestleMania 8 and you look at, the card that ended up being what it was, maybe it worked out for the better, and Ric Flair even talked about this on his podcast today. But one of the matches that we never got, that was hinted at in 2002 when the NWO came back, we ended up getting The Rock against Hollywood Hogan, and then we got Scott Hall going up against Stone Cold Steve Austin. Definitely, when you look at Stone Cold Steve Austin WrestleMania matches, I'm not want to take anything away from Scott Hall, but that just doesn't, it wasn't billed as like a big Stone Cold Steve Austin match. It definitely had its share of angles and segments. I can remember Stone Cold Steve Austin hog tying up each member of the NWO one by one, trying to get the numbers down where he can get to them one-on-one. But then we ended up getting the huge stare down of Rock and Hogan, which ended up being a challenge for WrestleMania. And Hogan and Rock went out there and knocked it out of the park. Stone Cold Steve Austin has always said that he thinks that the Scott Hall match, it didn't really deliver the way that people thought it was going to. And sometimes he says he had his problems with the creative. Sometimes he says he had problems with himself at that time. And he doesn't really remember everything that went down around that time. But he always sort of looks at it, he always gives Rock and Hogan their due and says they knocked it out of the park. But, he didn't have his best match that night. But he's also came out and he said that if he would have wrestled Hogan at that time, it just wouldn't have made a lot of sense. Austin was giving these fast-paced, real brawl matches, while Hogan, at that time, it's funny because we talk about it this time, Hogan, was starting to slow down, but Hogan would wrestle 8 more years. I think he had his last match in 2010 for TNA. But even though his body was way broken down at that point, Hogan could go out there and wrestle a great match, which we saw, from Hogan and Rock at WrestleMania that year. But even when you go to, you know, the Hulk Hogan interview on the Raw Homecoming, if you have that DVD, or if you have the 20th anniversary, it might even be on the network. I'm not 100% sure. But if you go there, it's Mean Gene interviewing Hulk Hogan, you know, and that was a big show because Raw had just moved from Spike TV back to its original home, USA, and they knocked everything out of the park, thinking that, you know, basically their ratings had started to fall because they got a little bit, you know, they were losing popularity, and they sort of thought that it was because they were on Spike instead of being on USA, and now they were coming back to USA, and all of a sudden people were going to come out of the woodwork, just say, oh, wrestling's back, and just think that maybe for the past few years that it was on Spike TV, they couldn't find it. But you know, Hulk Hogan, some people say that he flipped the script and he just went into business for himself, challenging Stone Cold Steve Austin. Some people think that Vince told Hogan to challenge him, and that maybe that would sort of give a little bit of kick in the ass to Stone Cold Steve Austin to accept the challenge, and then he would all have this big Hulk Hogan versus Stone Cold Steve Austin match for WrestleMania that year. Ended up never coming to be, and some people have pointed the finger at Stone Cold Steve Austin, basically saying that he didn't have anything, you know, to bring back to professional wrestling at that time. Stone Cold Steve Austin wrestled his last match in 2002, even though he sort of billed to come back at that one Cyber Sunday where he was going to fight Coachman. And then some people have said that basically at the last minute, WWF came to Austin and said, hey, you're going to lose the Coachman. And Austin said, fuck that, I ain't coming. There's dueling stories about that one. You know, that Austin was done wrestling. He wasn't going to come back for anything in the world. And we've seen that. Here we are building up to WrestleMania 32, and we still haven't got a Stone Cold Steve Austin match, even though each year, you know, we're like, oh, maybe he'll come back and fight CM Punk, or oh, maybe he'll come back and he'll fight Brock Lesnar, or maybe he'll have one more match against The Rock. You know, we've put every dream match opportunity in front of him, and he's never, you know, been able to take it. I think that honestly, even at that, you know, later WrestleMania, if that was billed around Raw Homecoming, even if that match would have happened, you know, it wouldn't have taken a lot. Hulk Hogan isn't the best wrestler in the world, but he's very smart at what he does. He doesn't have to do a whole bunch in order to do it. I don't know if it was money. I don't know if it was the one guy didn't want to do the honors for the other guy. I don't know why, honestly, they couldn't have just built the match together of Hulk Hogan against Stone Cold Steve Austin to see who was the better one, and then just have some heel, whether if it was like Randy Orton around that time being the legend killer, trying to find some, you know, moments to come out and attack Hogan and Austin, where Hogan and Austin basically, you just throw the match out. Maybe, you know, they did it at that one WrestleMania I was talking about with Sid and Hogan. There was no 3 count. There was no disqualification. There was no count out. Just all of a sudden, Papa Shango came running out. He attacked Hogan. Then Ultimate Warrior came out. Next thing you know, they ran off Sid and Papa Shango. And next thing you know, Warrior and Hogan are posing down. And the show's over. So, I don't know, maybe, you know, Randy could have came in trying to sneak, you know, a feel-good moment by doing a double RKO on these two dudes, and then all of a sudden they team up, they start beating up Randy Orton, and next thing you know, Hogan and Austin are posing, and we got that big picture for years. You know, WrestleMania 30 came around, and we had The Rock, we had Hogan, and we had Austin all in the ring at the same time. And when you listen to Stone Cold Steve Austin's podcast around that time, he's really saying that he tried to clear the air, that there was some unspoken heat between him and Hulk Hogan, where I think both guys thought they were the best superstar that Vince ever made, or that ever worked for Vince. And, you know, Austin said that he put over Hogan, and that was supposed to clear the air, that, you know, he's saying that Hogan was the best. Without Hogan, there would be no room for Austin to take over in those later 90 years. But I think when people look at the history of time, I think people will always want to know why Hogan and Austin never got it on and why that match never happened. Definitely when you have two big names, you want to know why these guys never wrestled. And I think that's a lot when you look at like Undertaker and John Cena, which was supposed to be a rumored match to take place at WrestleMania 32, which people have been looking forward to for years. I know when the streak was alive, it never really made sense why Cena wouldn't try to go after Undertaker's streak. I know that, you know, the fans would hate it and they would boo him more because Undertaker is such a protected character for people's, you know, childhood. They love this guy. But it would have been one hell of a match, and it definitely would have been the toughest match for Undertaker to have to try and beat the flagship bearer of the company, and it would be, you know, John Cena trying to beat the guy from the past, putting himself over as the new leader of the locker room. It would have made a lot of sense, but we'll see. Those are you know, wrestling's histories, mysteries.